One thing I've noticed about this latest cake trend, the fault line cake, is that most of the designs tend to be pretty, and most of them are made out of buttercream. Well, not today, I'm breaking the mold. Today I'm going to show you how I made this awesome alien fault line cake using nothing but fondant. I'm Janine, and you're watching That's Cakeable. So the making of this cake is quite intensive. What I've done is I've broken it into 3 separate parts, which I will timestamp in the description below. The first part is the making of the Xenomorph figurine. So I've taken some white sugar paste, rolled it into an elongated teardrop shape, made it very pointed at one end and quite flat and thick at the other. I then take my Dresden tool and I start marking out where I want the chin and neck to be. I use my Dresden tool as sort of like a mini rolling pin and push away the excess sugar paste into the neck area. I then use my fingers to pinch down the excess sugar paste into a neck shape. Now, anybody that knows aliens and xenomorphs know that they have a definite separation from the top of their head to the base of their head. So I've marked a line where that separation will be, and then I'm just pinching down a little bit at the bottom of the face for where his chin will be. Now I'm making a mark for where I want the xenomorph's mouth to be. And then I take my Dresden tool and I sort of just push in and make the cavity for where the mouth is going to be, which also creates the top lip. Pulling that chin forward, making sure it stays nice and long and thin. Now I'm drawing in where the top lip will be, and then I follow that line all the way down the side of the head to make that separation of the xenomorph's head that I was talking about. I flatten out a little bit next to his mouth to add a few details. I use my silicone shaper tool and just go in and make a few little dots. I then draw a line under those dots and make a few more little dots underneath that line. I make a few lines down the side of his chin and then a few dots at the front of his chin. Just smoothing it all out there, pushing up to make sure that the top lip is still accentuated. Sorry, the bottom lip. And now I'm no expert at alien anatomy, but they have like these pipey sort of things on the side of their head. So to create them, I took a piece of white fondant, rolled it into a thin strip, and then scored all along the side of that strip with my knife. I cut it out into a thinner rectangle and then just rolled it up onto itself. I cut off the excess fondant, gave it another little roll, and it was ready to attach to the side of our xenomorph's head. I did that just with a little bit of water, so it goes down the side of his head from the top of his mouth, which I'm using my silicone shaper tool to blend that in slightly, and then downwards towards his neck. Cut off the excess, and that part is done. I went ahead and added a thinner pipe underneath the first one. Just a few more little details, some ridges on the head there, and I popped him aside to dry. Now on to making the xenomorph's hand. So I've taken like an egg-shaped piece of fondant that I've flattened at one end, and then I just cut out a few grooves for fingers with my X-Acto blade. Using my own fingers, I start elongating those little tendrils and making sure that there's a little bit of a bump in between in the center, which is sort of like a knuckle, and then really elongating and pointing the top of the finger. Talking about fingers, please excuse mine. It's an occupational hazard, working with food coloring and not having a manicure. So So as you can see, I've made a knuckle area in the center of that finger, then just really draw out the end of the finger until it's like a claw. I go ahead and do that with all of the fingers. I thin down the actual hand part, and then I take my silicone shaper tool and just draw some lines from the center of the finger down the hand. Just gives it that little bit more detail. Cut off any excess and then pop that aside to dry. I dried mine over the corner of a styrofoam dummy so it would dry in a claw sort of shape. Now on to our Xenomorph's tail. So I've once again taken a piece of fondant and rolled it out into a very, very thin cone shape. Cut off any excess. I made sure I measured this against my cake to decide what length tail I wanted. And to make the scales, would you believe I used a 5-petal blossom cutter. So I've taken a piece of fondant, rolled it out very thinly, cut out some blossoms, and then cut off 2 of those blossoms. Took my petal cutter again and cut out a semicircle from the top petal. Pushed that down a little bit so it wasn't as sharp. And then just wrapped them around the tail with a bit of water. Amazing what you can make out of the things that you never thought you could make things out of. Scales out of a blossom cutter. Who'd have thunk it? I just continued making the scales and running them all the way down the length of the tail. Now for our ominous arrowhead at the end of our alien tail. I've just taken a piece of fondant that I've run my fingers down the center to make a groove. Then I took my X-Acto blade and cut out an arrowhead shape. I pointed the end nice and pointy because you want it to look deadly. Deadly. You want it to look deadly. To attach that to the top of the tail, just a little bit of water, a groove in the arrowhead so that it's got somewhere to fit into, and pop it onto the tail. I put a skewer in the end of the tail so I have something to attach the tail to the cake with. Then I set that aside to dry. Our next part is the face hugger. So to begin our face hugger, once again we're doing lots of long cones here, so another very long thin cone piece of fondant, sort of more rounded at the end this time. And then I push that down just a little bit, flattened it out a little bit, and run my fingers down the center once again to create that groove in the center, that ridge in the center, just like I did with the arrowhead tail for the Xenomorph. For the scales on this guy, I used my Dresden tool and just marked them in. Going upwards, across, and then downwards, all the way down the length of the face hugger's body. Now the best way I found to put my face hugger together was to attach it directly to the cake. Of course we haven't gotten to that part yet, but once you have, you just take some water and attach the body of the face hugger in the position you would like it on the top tier of the cake. Now the face hugger's claws are a little bit different, they're done in sections, so I've just rolled out very short thin snakes of white fondant, pinched each end just a little bit to make them look a bit bony, and then attached them together. I did 2, then I went ahead and did the front of the claw, which is very similar to the alien's claws, making sure that there's that knuckle in between, and very elongated at the top. Attach that to the other 2 little bones, and there it was. So I attached these in sort of separate pieces, decided where I liked the placement, attached them with a little bit of water to the face hugger's body, and that was pretty much it. Once again, I don't know much about the anatomy of face huggers, but I did check and they have 6 claws, so I did this 6 times. Does that make them an insect? To make the little, what I can only describe as egg sacs on the side of their body, I just took an egg-shaped piece of fondant, flattened it down, sort of rounded it out a little bit, and then went ahead and attached that to the body of the face hugger on the cake. One on each side, and that's done. Now let's get into making the cake. Okay, so for the purpose of this, I wanted to keep my cake, so I've made this using styrofoam, but I will tell you how to do it using cake. You would have your board attached to your cake, and you would have a hole drilled in that baseboard because you need a center pole for structure. That cake I put on top of a cake tin, which is the same size as my cake, using some piping gel to attach my fondant because I'm using styrofoam. I rolled out a very large piece of white fondant, covered the cake and the tin, and covered it exactly as I would cover a very tall cake, all the way to the bottom of the tin. I cut off the excess from the base, and then with some sliding around, because it's styrofoam, you wouldn't find as much of an issue with real cake, I went ahead and smoothed out the cake as normal. Now about a third of the way up the tin, I scored a line and cut off that excess fondant also. And then I began my fault line by using my Dresden tool to pick out different pieces of fondant. But I found it looked a little bit too structured and I wanted it to look more organic. So I then went ahead and just used my fingers to pick out the rest, and that worked. I set that aside to dry for about an hour until the fondant wasn't completely hard, but a lot firmer. And then came the scary part. You've got to flip it over. So to remove it, you must flip it upside down. I used a small palette knife to separate the fondant from the tin. Of course, it's not adhered to the tin because we haven't used any water or piping gel on the tin itself. Had to give it a bit of a shake, but it released. It came out just fine. Use my smoothers to make sure that that fault line is nice and neat and straight up and down. And of course, I went and did that twice, a bottom tier and a top tier. Now for our separator, I would recommend that you use styrofoam, once again with a hole drilled through the center because you will need to put it over a center pole. I'm attaching some fairy lights with some bent over florist wire to my separator. Take those fairy lights all the way around. Now, what I didn't show on camera was that I tried to attach my isomalt sugar crystals directly onto the styrofoam, and they did not stick. So I would recommend covering that styrofoam center in some fondant first, then adding your fairy lights, then using piping gel all the way around that separator. And that's just some isomalt crystals crushed up that I'm now pressing against that separator to give it that icicle effect. Lights on. Ooh, eerie. Now on to my favorite part, airbrushing my cake. So I decided to airbrush my cake black instead of using black fondant because black fondant tends to be quite soft due to the concentration of food coloring in it, and I needed my cake to stand sturdy. So I had it upside down first and made sure that I did the inside in black airbrush. Then I flipped it upside down and popped it on a pot and airbrushed the outside black. Then I went back in with a silver sheen to give it more of an industrial look. I did that on both of my tiers. And of course, I had to come in and give our Xenomorph some colour. So I did exactly the same thing to the head, the hands, and the tail. Now putting our cake together, as you can see, I've just used some of those same pipes that I used on the Xenomorph to decorate my bottom tier. I'm adding my separator now, which you would add over a center pole if it was cake. I'm getting into position, which position I want my lighting to be in. I've made a mark of where I want the front to be. And now I'm just putting a toothpick in there where I want my Xenomorph head to go so that it's all ready to attach once it's assembled. You can see that toothpick sticking out there. I attach my Xenomorph head using a little bit of piping gel just to make sure he's nice and secure. I went ahead and attached the hand in the place that I wanted. I had two hands, but the one ended up looking better, so I stuck with the one. You would then take your top tier and put that over the center pole. Now I'm just taking a little bit of piping gel, taking that Xenomorph tail, and very carefully with some needle nose pliers popping that into the top of the cake. Positioning it exactly where I want it. And there you have it, a fondant, alien themed fault line cake. It looks pretty awesome if I do say so myself. Well, I have become quite the fan of buttercream lately, but fondant's always been my ride or die. And I thought, what about those people out there in the same boat as me that want to create the same look as a fault line cake, but don't use buttercream? And that's where the idea for this cake came from. I also wanted to make it a little bit more dark, not quite as pretty as most fault line cakes we're seeing. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I think it turned out great. And if you like this video too, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell in the bottom to make sure that you are notified every time I upload new content. Thank you so much for joining me again this week, guys. If you'd like to see some videos of how I put my cake structures together with the center dowel that I spoke of making this cake, just check out these videos here and it will give you some idea. And you know what to do. Until I see you next time, go and get your cake on. Bye.